Good afternoon. Welcome to LitFest Online. My name is Chris Schüler. I'm a writer and former chairman of the Authors Club, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Hadley Freeman to discuss her book, House of Glass. Hadley is a journalist for The Guardian. You may well have seen her column in the paper. This book has been the work of many years, an exploration of her own family's history, that of a Jewish family spanning most of the 20th century. It's epic in scope. It takes in a huge swathe of European history, from a Polish shtetl to Paris between the wars, to the United States and Britain. It's been praised by Salman Rushdie as a magnificently vivid recreation of her Jewish family's experience, and by Nigella Lawson as utterly engrossing. Welcome, Hadley. Could you possibly tell us how you first got involved in tracing your family's history?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for organizing this. So thoughtful of you to put together this online festival. So sweet. All of us authors whose books came out in this plague very much appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So this all began almost exactly 20 years ago. I just got my job at The Guardian, and so I started thinking, okay, I'm a writer. I can actually admit to myself I'm a writer. And the first thing I wanted to write about was my grandmother. I found it very hard to put into words what it was I wanted to write. I just knew that she'd always seemed unhappy, and I knew there was some kind of story, but I didn't know how to find out anything about her, really. I wasn't a historian on any level. And I also didn't really know how to articulate her unhappiness. All I knew was that she didn't adhere to the story that I was taught as a Jewish American kid growing up in New York, which is that immigrant Jews who came from Europe to America had the happy ending. They were the lucky ones. And I could look at my grandmother and see how unhappy she was. And her brothers who'd stayed in France, who I knew, my great uncles Henri and Alex, they were very happy and lived these very glamorous, wealthy lives. And my grandmother was this kind of lower middle class housewife, at that point living in Miami, unhappily married to my grandfather. So I wanted to do something on that. So I started sort of researching documents online, and I found out that when she came to America to marry my grandfather in 1937, she actually went back to France 3 more times until the war stopped her doing that, which none of us knew about. So already I was thinking, okay, there's something here. No one knew about that. Her sons didn't know about that, my father and my uncle. And so I finally went to her old apartment, which my uncle Rich still lives in, and I was just looking through her closet, and I found this shoebox at the back of the closet, and I opened it up thinking it would just be shoes, and inside there were letters from the 1920s to the 1980s, photographs of people in concentration camps, metal prisoner of war plates, and photo albums from the 1920s in Poland when she was a child, and then also this drawing by Picasso at the bottom. So then I knew I had this big story that was actually about her and her brothers, and that was the next 15 years of my life.
That sounds absolutely amazing. The way you casually say, there's a drawing by Picasso at the bottom. In fact, it's particularly your great uncle Alex, his experiences as first as a couturier and then as an art dealer brought him in contact with many sort of huge stars of the French fashion and art worlds. You mentioned in the book that one of the first people he came into contact with when he arrived in Paris from Poland was Marc Chagall, and he later became a good friend of Picasso's. Would you like to sort of, and also of Christian Dior? I mean, these are just huge names. It must have been extraordinary to discover those sort of leaping out of your family history.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Alex's story was the one I knew best because he died in 1999, so I was 21 then. So I did know him. I was quite close to him. I would go to Paris to have lunch with him. Once my family moved to London, he came to my bat mitzvah. And I would go to his apartment in Paris and see all these paintings. There'd be Chagall's, Van Gogh's, Picasso's. So I knew he had this extraordinary life, but I didn't really know much about it. And we also didn't know how much to believe of what Alex said. And then in about 2014, my uncle Rich found Alex's unpublished memoir in my grandmother's belongings in the apartment. And that was incredible. None of us had known he'd done this. And so I was reading it, and I still was reading it with a very skeptical eye, because Alex was known as a bit of a blusterer, a bit of a kind of exaggerator, and everything. So I fact checked everything, and turned out everything was true. So the whole story, which none of us knew about, was he became a couturier in the 1920s in Paris after they'd fled Poland, and he writes in the book, "My first draftsman was Christian Dior." And I read this and I just thought, no way can this be true. And it was fortunate that at that exact moment I was reading about this, the Christian Dior exhibition was going on at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So I contacted them and asked to speak to the curators and the historians, and I showed them this, and they were looking at the dates, and they said, oh yes, that's absolutely right. That's what he was doing on those dates. He was then still this young draftsman just trying to get into fashion and working for young couturiers for very little money. So it was completely true. And then Alex writes in his memoir, once the war began and he fled down to the south of France, and he said, I was sharing my clothes with Christian Dior and hanging out with him at his family place. And I thought, this can't be true. So I went back to the curators, and they said, oh yes, that's where Dior was then. And he was very small, and Alex, I knew, I'd known him, was about 5 foot tall. So they would have been sharing, sorry to throw off my phone there. So they would have been sharing clothes, and he was at his family's place, which was very near where Alex was staying down in the south of France. So turned out all to be true.
Could you say a little more about your grandmother, who comes over as well, you mentioned her unhappiness, but you also in the book mentioned her elegance, that she was always sort of immaculately dressed in incredibly stylish French clothes in the middle of, kind of suburban Miami. Yeah. Could you say a little more about her? Because I believe it was her mystique that first sort of drew you into this story.
Very much. I hadn't really thought about, how different she was from other grandmothers when I was a child. She died when I was 16. And as I got older and I became increasingly interested in fashion in my late teens, I sort of started thinking about how she dressed. She would dress in these very almost aggressively French styles. She would dress in these like Chanel style jackets, these Yves Saint Laurent style peasant blouses, and narrow cigarette trousers. And this is in Long Island originally, and then Miami. And most other Jewish grandmothers didn't dress like that. She would always have her little mini Dior bag. She had her Louis Vuitton luggage that she saved up for. She only wore French cosmetics, Guerlain, Chanel, all that kind of thing. And I just increasingly became aware that this was her way of asserting her identity in America. She had been born in Poland. She went to Paris when she was about 14, but she always thought of herself as French. And I actually didn't know she spent that long in Poland until I started researching this book. To me, she was completely French. She would keep this really strong French accent. Everything was oh la la, oui 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 oui, da 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 da. She'd tell me and my sister to call her grand-mère. She would speak to us in French. She was French, and yet she lived in America for almost 60 years. She was only in France really for 13 years, and yet she maintained, she was Frencher than French. I only ever saw her eat croissants. That was her way of telling people she did not belong in America, and that was her way of kind of expressing her unhappiness.
Yes, there's a very strong theme emerges from the book of sort of identity, of the way we refashion ourselves, the way your grandmother, Sala, defiantly asserted her French identity, whereas her brother, Alex, who actually remained in France throughout his life, stubbornly hung on to his Yiddish accent.
Yeah, he never believed that outsiders would see him as anything other than a Jew. He didn't believe that Jews were ever seen as anything but Jews. And what happened to him during the war proved that. Before the war, he'd been this successful couturier, making clothes for the daughters of generals who were then in the Vichy government, hanging out with the beau monde, running around Montmartre with, these, successful artists, Chagall and all those people. And still, he was sent to the camp. So for him, he was always defiantly Jewish. He thought assimilation was a myth. And he was very proud to keep his Yiddish accent. Having said that, he didn't do anything religious. I never saw him at synagogue except at my bar mitzvah. But for him, he was a Jew first. And, frankly, he would put it stronger than this, but, forget the rest of you, is what he would basically say.
Yeah, almost incredibly, he survived the war first in Paris and then in Vichy-occupied France. would you like to sort of? I mean, that was a bit of that was something of a mystery for you, and involved a certain amount of sort of research and investigation, didn't it?
Yeah, that took, I'd say, half the amount of time I spent on this book, because there were a lot of files on Alex that the Vichy government and the Germans kept, and I had to sort of track them down at all these different archives around France, with the help of a very kind and generous historian called Daniel Lee, whose own book is coming out in November, I should say, The SS Officer's Armchair. Anyway, so Alex was being very much watched because he was a very he wasn't someone who hid himself. So they knew who he was. They knew he was Jewish. They knew he was running around France. Once he got down to the south of France, he was allowed to open up his couture salon down there because he had fought in the war before France fell. He had fought in the Narvik campaign in Norway and got a Bronze Star. So in recognition of his service, he was allowed to open the salon. Nonetheless, he was still very much watched. You know, there were Vichy officers going there, but also resistance people going there. So it was this very confusing situation. Anyway, eventually he antagonized too many people, particularly Germans who started coming down to the south of France, and he was tortured, beaten up, and put onto a train to Drancy, which is one of the concentration camps in France. And I knew that we all knew this story. He would always tell the story that he escaped from the train, and no one believed it. So I checked the Drancy records, and there was no record of Alex McGee, which is the name he took, or Alex Glass, which was his real name, getting off at Drancy. So fine. And then I went down to Nice, which is where he would have boarded, and there on the passenger list, for want of a better term, was his name. He was put on the train, and I don't want to give away too much, I guess. I don't want to spoil or anything, but I was able to find, through a lot of luck and perseverance and help from Daniel Lee, what happened and how he survived. And I was able to find the place where he survived and where he spent the war, and it was pretty amazing.
Sadly, one of his brothers was not so fortunate or resourceful, whatever. That was...
Should I describe that story? Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there. So there were three brothers. So Henri, Jacques, Alex, and then my grandmother. And Jacques, the second brother, was always this very gentle, passive man who just kind of went along with what people wanted him to do. And his story was much more traditional of the immigrant Jews who arrived in France. He arrived from Poland. He immediately began work as a tailor in the Marais, which was the Jewish district. He did go off to fight for France when the war started. Then he came back to Paris. France fell. Jews were told to register in the first register, sort of census of the Jews. His brothers refused to put their names down. Jacques immediately went and put his name down, and he was in one of the first roundups, which was the roundup of the green tickets, is what it was called. There was a green ticket put through his door saying, "Come to this address at this time in the Marais." He went. His wife brought with him some clothes, and he was immediately put onto a train and sent out to Pithiviers, which was a concentration camp. The extraordinary story about Jacques, though, which makes him unusual, is that he was actually allowed to leave Pithiviers. This was another story Alex told all of us, that Jacques came home to see the birth of his baby daughter because his wife was still in Paris. And no one believed this. This just seemed insane. And I went to the people at Cercil, which is the archives of concentration camps in France, and they'd never heard of this. They said it was impossible. And then I went to the Shoah Museum in Paris and found Jacques' ticket. And there it was, said permission to leave the 30th of December to the 31st. So he did come back to Paris, saw the birth of his daughter. His brothers were there, and they said, "You have to run away now. This is your greatest chance." And his wife said, "Il a donné sa parole." He gave his word. And so he went back to the concentration camp. I'm afraid we're being interrupted by my children. I'm so sorry. Boys.
Hello.
Okay. You guys have to go now. Okay, Mommy's doing some work. Okay. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry, that's great.
Now, can you shut the door? Thank you. Now you see what I was having to work with the whole time I was writing my book. Many visitations from my children.
Yeah.
Sorry about that to everyone.
No, not at all. Now, where were we?
Concentration camp. So he went back to Pithiviers, and a few months after that, he was sent to Auschwitz, where he died, where he was killed, I should say.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the one thing that comes over in the book is or it came over very strongly to me, is the extraordinary singularity of every family's experience of these historical events. And even within your family, the difference between the experience of the siblings. Your grandmother, well, it was Alex persuaded your grandmother to marry an American before the war.
Yeah.
Get out altogether.
Yeah, that's right.
Very much against her will.
Absolutely. So Alex just sort of turned up to my grandmother's apartment one night in January 1937 with this American, and they're all having dinner. And okay, Max. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Max, boys out. Thank you. Shut the door. Max, shut the door. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry.
I'm so sorry. I'll just shut the door. Totally professional around here. It's a very, very sleek operation I run.
Don't worry, we are all of us working from home.
I feel like that man on the BBC News a few years ago trying to talk about Korea, and his children marched into the room. Anyway, so Alex turned up to the apartment with this American. They're having dinner, and then suddenly halfway through dinner, this American turns to my grandmother and says, "I'm in love with you. You're the most beautiful woman in the world I've ever seen. Come with me to America and I will take care of you." My grandmother's just like, who is this crass American that my brother has brought to the apartment? She was actually engaged at this point to a socialist dentist in Paris. The American leaves. Alex turns to her and says, "You have to marry him. You have no choice. The Nazis are coming." Alex knew this ahead of a lot of people because there was a lot of anti-Semitism growing in the art world. So he saw already how, for example, Chagall was being treated and not being allowed to have exhibitions and not being reviewed in a lot of the art magazines. So Alex saw this coming before a lot of others. He said, "The Nazis are coming. France is not going to protect us. You have to go. If you go, you can get the rest of us out. If you don't go, you're condemning us all to death." Henri, her other brother, and his wife Sonia agreed. And so very, very reluctantly, my grandmother went off to America. So she represented this sort of emigration strand of the story that I wanted to tell. I really I couldn't figure out how to tell the story for ages. And then I was talking to a friend, an Israeli friend, who was sort of helping me with the structure. And I said, "There's just so much story in this book. How do I separate it?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, tell me what happened to all of them." And I said, "Well, Henri, the older brother, stayed in Paris during the war. He was hidden. Jacques was captured. Alex was sort of captured and then escaped and sort of joined the resistance. And then my grandmother went off to America." And he said, "Well, those are the four kind of strands of Jewish experience during the war. You hide, you're captured, you're defiant, or you emigrate." And then that was it. And then I went to
Yes. Henri, who also survived, invented a machine for microfilming documents and became very, very successful after the war.
That's right. That's right. So he was an engineer. He trained in Krakow, and then he came to Paris. And in the late 1930s, he invented this machine that could microfilm documents and shrink them down and then later blow them back up. And so during the war, he and his wife Sonia stayed in Paris. Sonia basically stayed. And Henri traveled around the country, shrinking town planning documents, people's bank records, the planning documents for various ports, including the Havre port, to save them from the Nazis and Vichy government destroying them. And then after the war, thanks to him, all those things were saved. So the Havre port was able to be rebuilt thanks to Henri's machine. And he was nearly caught so many times. He built the machine in a building where the Nazis were. And yet he had this fake identity card that Sonia had got for him on the black market, saying he was this Catholic and his name was Glass, not Glass. And because of that, he was saved. And then after the war, he continued to make these machines and he became hugely, hugely wealthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're probably running towards the end of our time slot. I just wanted to ask, you do, in the course of the book, reflect on the rise once again of anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States. How were you aware of that when you embarked on the book, or did it sort of did it sort of happen while you were already writing?
I think, I mean, it was happening before I started. I think it's what spurred me on to finally writing it after 18 years of research. So it was 18 years of research and then 18 months of writing. And I'm sure what spurred me on was seeing the rise of the far right fascism in Europe.
Yeah.
The Brexit referendum, which was so nationalistic, the election of Donald Trump on such a nationalistic platform, and him describing, you know, anti-Jewish protesters as very fine people, and also the anti-Semitism scandals that were going on in Labour at the time. Those four things sort of made me feel, okay, maybe this isn't just me talking about my old relatives. Maybe this has some relevancy for today. And I mean, I do think, you know, before I would try, you know, I would think, well, you know, is it worth me just telling my family story? It is a good story. It is a good story. And I feel like people do like good stories. But suddenly this felt more urgent and like I had to do it now. There was no more just waiting around and watching the sun set outside my window. I had to sit down and actually write this thing.
Yeah. No, I do think there's, you know, well, particularly in recent years, I think there's sort of added kind of, well, almost duty really for those of us who share something of that heritage to sort of bear witness to it, you know, in the face of sort of denial. You know, extraordinary when you know it's actually happened to members of your own family.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I really enjoyed the book as well. I think it's, you know, I would recommend it to anyone. It's an absolutely compelling read, and you know, as I said, it embraces a huge sweep of 20th century European history, and at the same time, a very, very intimate and very personal story. Hadley, thank you so much.
Thank you, and I'm so sorry again about the interruptions. I'm so
don't worry about that.
Thank you, Chris.